This subcommittee will come to order. Good afternoon. We convene this hearing today to gain a deeper understanding of the administration's continued efforts to engage with Asia at the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation and East Asia Summits. This hearing will examine the outcomes of APEC and EAS and determine how Congress can support the expansion of U.S. presence in the region. The APEC Summit convened 21 member economies in Manila to discuss economic growth and integration in the region, which is no light task. As a bloc, APEC countries represent over half the world's GDP and 44% of all the global trade. Given that summit occurred immediately following the Paris attacks, the fight against ISIS was a large part of the conversation. The heads of state at the summit rightly took a united stance against terrorism and stressed the importance of using economic tools to address the root causes of such evils. I'm curious about how Asia's views of terrorism may or may not have changed at this event. I just returned from a trip to Taiwan, where I had the opportunity to meet with President Ma and leaders of the opposition DPP party. As a strong supporter of Taiwan's participation on the global stage, I'm encouraged to see Taiwan's membership and the engagement in APEC. Still, I'd like to see additional partners in the Asia-Pacific region take advantage of membership in APEC, including India, the region's third largest and fastest growing economy. As APEC would greatly benefit from the inclusion of the next global economic powerhouse, I urge our administration to support India's candidacy for APEC membership. APEC also provided a platform for leaders of TPP countries to hold meetings following the completion of the agreement. We'll be watching closely as the parties work toward ratification, though it seems that the TPP's strategic value continues to hold. Indonesia and the Philippines and South Korea have each expressed interest or intent to seek inclusion in the deal. Experts say the completed negotiation of TPP is a major blow to RCEP, China's rival to the agreement. I would be interested, though, to hear from our administration witnesses how they see or foresee TPP fitting into the regional architecture with a number of competing trade deals in Asia. And I'm sure Mr. Sherman will have his thoughts and comments too, which I welcome. I actually find it quite refreshing. It's kind of fun. President Obama also visited the Gregorio del Pilar, a former Coast Guard cutter that is now a centerpiece of the Philippine Navy, to talk about the defense of our allies, maritime security, and the South China Sea. He announced a $250 million plan to provide assistance to regional partners to improve their maritime capabilities, signaling that China's belligerent activities would be a prominent agenda item at both summits, even in light of APEC's economic focus, and I welcome that. I think that kind of clarity is badly needed, so thank you. Maritime security was discussed in depth at the East Asia Summit in Kuala Lumpur, immediately following APEC, bringing 18 members of consultations on political and strategic issues. Even after President Xi gave his assurance to President Obama and the public that China would not militarize the man-made islands of the South China Sea, China continues to build dual-use facilities on them. China's paper-thin efforts to characterize the construction of assets with military applications as a public service made clear the dishonesty in prior statements. Despite this, I was really glad to see the summit chairman's statement reaffirm the importance of the freedom of navigation and overflight in the region and supported a rules-based order in the maritime space. The EAS also provided an opportunity for discussions of other interests to include terrorism, energy, health, development, combating human trafficking, and poverty reduction. I had the recent opportunity to meet with representatives from all the ASEAN nations and reassured them of our support for the development, democracy, and security in their countries and across the region. Summits such as APEC and EAS have provided substantial opportunities for the United States to bolster our foreign policy goals in the region, strengthen our partnerships and alliances, open our markets, and promote sound international law and norms. And with that, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses. Members present will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the official hearing record, and without objection, the record will be will remain open for 5 calendar days to allow for statements, question, and extraneous materials subject to the length limitation in the rules. And Mr. Sherman, I'll turn to you.
I oppose the pivot to Asia if by that phrase we mean redirecting our military focus to a place where there are a few reefs that we can quibble about at a time when ISIS and the Iranian-led Shiite alliance are killing tens of thousands of people and killing as many Americans as they can. It may be useful politically in Beijing to focus nationalist attention on these reefs, and of course it meets the desire of some in our Pentagon to focus on a confrontation of uniformed and advanced militaries with which they are comfortable. But the fact is, these so-called islands, reefs, are basically useless. We're told they're important because ships passing close to them involve hundreds of billions of dollars of trade. That's true. They're all going in and out of Chinese ports, and I do not think that China will blockade its own ports. That being said, we do believe in freedom of navigation. We should continue to assert that, but not as the chief focus of our military. What's happening now at the Pentagon is they are abandoning the research and procurement and structuring and planning necessary to deal with the problems of the Middle East and focusing their attention to building advanced naval systems designed solely to confront China. Keep in mind, if these so-called islands are of any military value, any economic value, that value does not accrue to the U.S. taxpayer. It accrues to Japan, Korea, the Philippines, etc. While we are, without much attention, spending hundreds of billions of dollars in procurement and planning at the Pentagon, redirecting our military efforts to the defense of these supposedly valuable islands, the amount of additional money being spent on defense by the countries that claim to own these islands pales in insignificance. Much brouhaha about Japan making the slightest change in where it will deploy its forces. The fact that there's so much brouhaha over that proves how insignificant the Japanese. I hope I said Japan and not China for the as to the application of their forces. The fact is, Japan claims the islands, but claims that we should defend them, and has not insignificantly increased its military budget. The one exception to this on burdening sharing is Taiwan. They want to buy a couple frigates for them. The Congress has authorized it. It's been planned. They're ready, and it's time to deliver them. And we'll have legislation on that to push the delivery of those frigates. We do need to focus on the interests of the American middle class and the American taxpayer that sends us to Washington. This TPP is such a terrible economic deal for the American middle class that it's being sold as good geopolitics, because it can't be sold on the basis of economics. That as a method of containing China, it is a fantastically good deal for China, and they didn't even have to show up to the negotiations. Two things. First, we're told this deal sets precedents of the world adopting America's rules. They're not America's rules. They're the rules that have destroyed the American middle class over the last 30 years. They're Wall Street's rules. But in one case, the rules reflected in the TPP are not Wall Street's rules. They're Beijing's rules. This is the holy grail that establishes that currency manipulation is allowed, almost glorified, in the text of this agreement, or should I say the missing pages of the text of this agreement. So it establishes for China's benefit, and I hate to say it, but also for Japan's benefit, that currency manipulation is allowed and cannot be stopped. Second, under the rules of origin, goods that are admitted to be 30% made in Vietnam or Malaysia, but 70% made in China get duty-free access to the United States. Now, it's not just 30%, because if a Chinese company creates a factory in Vietnam and then labels things saying, well, at least 30% of the goods were, They're making all the decisions as to how to allocate the costs of production. They're doing the intercompany invoicing. Goods that are 3% made in Vietnam could be labeled 30% made in Vietnam, and this agreement does not employ 50 or 100,000 accountants to go look at every intercompany invoice, which is what would be necessary. So this is a free trade deal par excellence for China. Now I know they're fainting and saying, "Oh, we want to join the deal." They get all the benefits of the deal just as soon as Congress approves it. Well, maybe only 97% of the benefits. They'll still have to do a little bit of the work in Vietnam or Malaysia. So if this deal cannot be sold as good economics for the American middle class, it will be sold on the basis of patriotism, because Americans are patriotic. And we will tell our constituents, you got to lose jobs, but it's necessary for our security. No, it's necessary to further enhance China and Wall Street. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Barra?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the chairman for having this hearing, because obviously when we're thinking about the Asian markets, some of the fastest growing markets that are critically important to our economy and growing our economy, making sure that we have fair access to those markets and our companies. Also, I'd like to align myself with the chairman's statements that what is happening in the South China Sea is critically important, of both strategic value as well as it's quite important to make a statement today so we don't have to engage militarily in the future. And it is incredibly important that international law, international waterways, and international norms in the South China Sea are recognized. I've stated in committee many times that China's incursions here, their building of these man-made islands, really go outside international norms. And it is very important that we send a strong message that that is not okay. Extremely important that we keep these markets open. Extremely important that we create a fair playing field for American companies, for the American worker, and evaluate how we engage again in an incredibly important region of the world. So again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. I look forward to the testimony of the witnesses.
I thank the gentleman. We're really appreciative to have both very distinguished witnesses joining us this afternoon. First, Mr. Michael Fuchs is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Strategy and Multilateral Affairs in the Department of State's Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs. And Mr. Bruce Hirsch is the Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Japan, Korea, and APEC. And you've been really busy lately. We'd like to start with you, Mr. Fuchs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Sherman, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today, testify on the recently concluded East Asia Summit and U.S.-ASEAN Summit. I'd also like to thank the committee for your continued leadership in supporting and promoting engagement in the Asia-Pacific region. 2 weeks ago, as you know, President Obama made his 9th trip to the Asia-Pacific, which is a reflection of the continued importance of the region to U.S. national interests and the administration's commitment to advancing the rebalance strategy. A central component of this strategy is what I would call a rebalance within the rebalance to Southeast Asia and those 10 countries that make up the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. Given its strategic location and the essential role it plays in the region's multilateral institutions, ASEAN is at the core of one of the world's most dynamic regions. This year in particular has been a historic one for our engagement with ASEAN. At the U.S.-ASEAN Summit, the President and ASEAN leaders elevated the U.S.-ASEAN relationship to a strategic partnership and agreed on a new plan of action for 2016 to 2020. And we were pleased to announce that the ASEAN leaders had accepted the President's invitation to attend a special summit in the United States in 2016. Taken together, these summits are charting a course forward with ASEAN, guiding our efforts to work together on everything from climate change to trafficking in persons to maritime security and beyond. The President also participated in the East Asia Summit, which has quickly become the premier forum for addressing political and security issues in the Asia-Pacific region. This year was its 10th anniversary, and leaders used the occasion to endorse a number of institutional reforms to move the EAS closer to being the strong, effective institution that the region needs to support the rules-based order. This year, the leaders of the EAS also endorsed statements on key regional challenges, including maritime cooperation, cyber issues, preventing health pandemics, and countering violent extremism, which will help build a foundation for regional cooperation. And as the region's premier institution for addressing political and security concerns, the leaders also focused on the South China Sea. At both the EAS and the US-ASEAN summits, the President directly addressed the maritime disputes in the South China Sea. All countries of the EAS, claimants and non-claimants alike, have a vested interest in how this issue is addressed. While the United States is not a claimant and takes no position on the sovereignty of particular features in the South China Sea, the President used the East Asia Summit to convey the United States' deep and abiding commitment to freedom of navigation and overflight and other lawful uses of the sea, upholding international law, and the maintenance of peace and stability in the region. He made clear that the United States will stand by our treaty obligations and our security commitments. The President encouraged ongoing efforts to develop a code of conduct between ASEAN and China. He also urged parties to take more immediate steps to lower tensions, including a halt to land reclamation, construction of new facilities, and any further militarization of outposts. He noted the unanimous October 29th decision of the Arbitral Tribunal regarding its jurisdiction in the case between the Philippines and China, and expressed support for the arbitration process as a peaceful mechanism to resolve disputes. The level of concern over events in the South China Sea was clear from across the region during the summit. At the East Asia Summit, 15 of the 18 leaders present expressed concerns over tensions in the South China Sea, and 10 of those leaders emphasized the importance of the non-militarization of outposts. And this year, ASEAN itself sent a direct and unmistakable signal to China on the South China Sea, referring in its own summit statement to concerns about the possible militarization of outposts. This chorus of support on the issue of non-militarization is a step forward, and one we intend to work with others to build on in the coming weeks and months. Fundamentally, of course, these maritime security issues are about rules, not rocks. The question is whether countries work to uphold international legal rules and standards, or whether they flout them. It's about whether countries work together with others to uphold peace and stability, or to use coercion and intimidation to secure their interests. And I want to reaffirm here today that we will continue to champion respect for international law, freedom of navigation and overflight and other lawful uses of the seas, unimpeded lawful commerce, and the peaceful resolution of disputes. Finally, while my colleague Bruce Hirsch will address APEC in more detail, I'd like to note quickly that we view APEC as the premier economic forum in the region for advancing free and open trade and investment, as well as for fostering cooperation and promoting sustainable and equitable growth. The United States' priority in APEC is to enhance regional integration and stability while establishing systems conducive to U.S. economic competitiveness. So in conclusion, I thank the committee for its interests in these issues and look forward to working with you in pursuit of U.S. interests in the Asia-Pacific. I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you. Mr. Hirsch.
Chairman Salmon, Ranking Member Sherman, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on the recently concluded APEC Leaders Meeting and on APEC's importance for U.S. economic and trade engagement in the Asia-Pacific region. The Asia-Pacific region continues to be a dynamic and growing part of the global economy. The 21 APEC economies account for nearly 60% of global GDP and international trade and are home to 2.8 billion consumers, 40% of the world's population. U.S. engagement in APEC plays an important role in helping to secure the economic benefits offered by the Asia-Pacific region and to address the challenges we face there. APEC remains the premier regional forum through which we are able to advance U.S. trade policy objectives in a leadership role. With other economic powers vying for influence in the region, U.S. active engagement remains essential. The unique characteristics of APEC make it an effective forum to advance work on emerging issues in the trade and economic area. First, given how much the region has benefited from trade, APEC economies generally embrace open markets and ideas that advance free trade. Second, APEC outcomes are non-binding and voluntary in nature, thus allowing APEC economies to be more forward-leaning and open-minded when exploring new issues, in contrast to other venues where achieving consensus is more difficult. Third, APEC initiatives can take a variety of forms with varying levels of participation by economies. This flexibility allows for more creative and diverse approaches to new and emerging issues. Finally, APEC has a diverse membership. As a result, initiatives that emerge from APEC carry significant weight in other fora. For example, the WTO Information Technology Agreement and its subsequent expansion have their origins in APEC. Similarly, The 2011 commitment by APEC leaders to reduce tariffs on environmental goods gave impetus to the launch of the WTO Environmental Goods Agreement. And APEC's long-term work on supply chain facilitation helped lay the groundwork for the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement. In 2015, with the Philippines as host, APEC continued its work to improve the business environment in the Asia-Pacific and to facilitate trade. This work culminated in a number of outcomes at the November 18th to 19th Leaders Meeting, including on topics of great interest to U.S. stakeholders, such as the reaffirmation of the commitment to reduce environmental goods tariffs, endorsement of substantive work on the Internet and digital economy, a mandate to elevate APEC work on services trade, and an instruction to complete work on APEC best practices on trade secrets protection and enforcement. Other outcomes were reached on electric vehicle standards, trade in healthcare products, and advertising standards, among others. The U.S. has been a leader on all of these issues. Finally, APEC leaders also noted the recent conclusion of the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations. All 12 TPP members are in APEC, and most other APEC economies have expressed an interest in the agreement. Given this connection, the United States and other APEC members have a real opportunity over the coming years to educate APEC members about the benefits of adopting policies that will meet the requirements of high-standard agreements like the TPP. In this way, U.S. engagement in APEC will further serve to support the objective of creating a rules-based trading system for the Asia-Pacific region. Looking ahead to 2016, when Peru will serve as APEC host, the United States will have an opportunity to push for significant outcomes on digital and services trade, as well as on trade secrets protection and enforcement. APEC will assess progress on its target of improving supply chain performance by 10% and look beyond that target. And we will continue to explore ways to ensure that the benefits of economic growth extend to businesses of all sizes. One of APEC's successes lies in its mandate to engage with the business community. The APEC Business Advisory Council plays an important role by providing its views and priorities to APEC officials throughout the year. In the United States, we have a long-standing and close working relationship with the National Center for APEC. We will also continue to consult with Congress as we plan our agenda for APEC in 2016. We are grateful for the interest of this subcommittee in this regard. In conclusion, I want to thank you for the opportunity to discuss the outcomes of the APEC Leaders Meeting and the importance of APEC to U.S. engagement in the Asia-Pacific region. As that region continues to grow in economic and strategic importance, U.S. leadership in APEC will be increasingly vital. Thank you very much.
Thank you both very much. You know, for the last several administrations, we've operated on an overarching policy toward China under the umbrella of a term that just makes me feel about like the time I remember getting my tooth drilled on without Novocaine. It's called strategic ambiguity, because I believe if we need clarity anywhere, we need it with China. And on that vein, I would like you to pass something on to your boss. I applaud him for what he said about the rules of the road in maritime space in the South China Sea and the overflights. I think that kind of strategic clarity and that recommitment to something that's incredibly important, not just to the United States, but to the world at large, was badly needed, and thank him for showing that leadership. I don't think we do that enough. We've all been concerned about how we juxtapose this pivot to Asia with the needs and the crisis in the Middle East. Based on this year's Asia-Pacific summits, and by the way, I think the pivot to Asia is a great thing. I don't want to go on record saying that. I think it's incredibly important that we can walk and chew bubblegum at the same time, and that we can do more than one thing. But based on this year's Asia-Pacific summits, how do you assess the region's views toward transnational terrorist threats? And have these summits yielded any lessons or insights we can apply to better balance global crises with long-term policy goals and to remain engaged in Asia while handling responsibilities elsewhere? Do you feel that the recent events in the Middle East and Europe have changed Asia-Pacific perceptions about terrorism and how to address it? Mr. Fuchs, can I start with you?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it's obviously a very important issue that you've raised, and I think coming back from these summits, I can say without a doubt that the countries of the region are focused on this issue. And this is something that obviously many of the countries in the region in Southeast Asia have been focused on for a number of years. These are threats to them as well. And so this is why this has been a priority for us, working both bilaterally with many of these countries to strengthen their capacity, information sharing, to deal with these issues and to coordinate and cooperate on them. And it's also why we've tried to engage through these regional institutions, including ASEAN and the East Asia Summit, to build broader cooperation throughout the region on dealing with these issues. In 2014, last year's summit in Burma, the leaders of the East Asia Summit adopted a statement about the need to stem the flow of foreign fighters to and from Iraq and Syria, and agreed to take a number of steps to do so and to cooperate on that endeavor. This year, following up on that, and obviously the horrible attacks of Paris had just taken place right before the leaders of the EAS met this year. And so that was very much on their minds as well. And they adopted a statement on countering violent extremism, and again, trying to set out some actions and some principles, at least, that countries can use to cooperate when it comes to this important issue. So without a doubt, I can say this is on their minds, and this is something that this region is seized with.
Well, and one of the rationales I use for getting or trying to get Taiwan observer status in Interpol is that when we have a global terrorist crisis, then it needs to be all hands on deck. Mm-hmm. And hopefully all of these countries understand that. It's not, nobody's responsibility solely, it is collectively our responsibility to deal with this horrible global threat. I have a question for you, Mr. Hirsch. 12 out of the 21 APEC countries are members already of TPP. How does the conclusion of the TPP affect where APEC fits in the U.S. policy towards Asia? And how do you reconcile APEC's principles of volunteerism and open regionalism with the TPP, which is a binding agreement?
Thank you very much, and those are very good questions. The TPP is going to serve as a race to the top, we hope, in terms of the rules of the road in Asian trade. We've had a lot of interest from a number of non-TPP parties in what's in the agreement, and we believe that the very conclusion of the agreement will help to emphasize the importance of maintaining high standards. With regard to reconciling APEC's voluntarism with the approach in the TPP, APEC has a very useful and important role to play by virtue of the fact that not every member of APEC is in the TPP. Because it is a voluntary organization, APEC members who are not members of TPP will be more open to experimentation, exploration of ideas that ultimately will allow them to adopt policies that are consistent with high standard agreements like the TPP. So APEC can continue to serve as an incubator for good policy ideas in the region, and it can help us to educate countries in the region about the value of high standards such as those in TPP.
Thank you. Mr. Barra.
Thank you, Chairman. I applaud the work that the administration's done in the pivot and laying some of the groundwork, working with the APEC nations. Obviously, they're creating economic cooperation to help their region, and our partnership there certainly is important. Also think a good TPP certainly starts to build a framework for economic cooperation throughout the Pacific Rim nations. So as we evaluate the TPP and look at that and consider it here in this body, I think many of us will be doing it with that eye to the future. Does it lay the foundation for a fair trade policy across the entire Pacific Rim region? As I think about APEC, though, and some of the steps, I have a unique focus on the U.S.-India relationship, and certainly a lot of the discussion that is going on in economic cooperation between the United States and India. Certainly Prime Minister Modi and President Obama have, both echoed a similar theme to open up stronger economic ties between both countries. While the bilateral investment treaty is not moving as quickly as I'd like to see, certainly as a starting point. But another starting point that many of us have talked about is India's desire to join APEC, and some have suggested that the United States should take a more active role in pushing for India's inclusion. I'd be curious as to what challenges and what suggestions either one of you would have for both members here in Congress who might suggest that we push to include India, but then also what India ought to be doing to make it more palatable to join APEC.
Thank you very much. Well, we welcome India's interest in joining APEC. It's important for economies that are interested in APEC to align their trade and investment policies and their economic reform plans with APEC's longstanding commitments to trade and investment liberalization and market-driven economic reforms. APEC is an important consensus-based economic institution that deals with a wide range of issues, and it'll be important for India to demonstrate its commitment to that consensus-based approach, as well as to free and open trade and investment policies that APEC espouses. So, we certainly will want to understand better how APEC fits into India's economic reform efforts.
If I may add, Congressman, perhaps taking a step back as well, I think as you mentioned, this administration and President Obama have taken a real interest in engaging with India and strengthening our partnership with India, and that includes, near the top of that list, engaging with India with respect to the Asia-Pacific region. Obviously, President Obama's trip there earlier at the beginning of this year, they released a joint vision statement on our cooperation between our two countries in the Asia-Pacific, the goals that we share. In this administration, we have begun a series of other dialogues, including a bilateral U.S.-India dialogue about the Asia-Pacific, a trilateral dialogue with India as well as Japan, covering issues with respect to the Asia-Pacific region. And so, broadly speaking, we are engaged at multiple different levels with India, trying to deepen the relationship and the cooperation that we can pursue together on a wide range of issues in the Asia-Pacific.
Great. So, and I agree, laying that foundation today, which, again, we may not see the return on this investment for, several years or maybe a decade, but it's important that we start to lay that foundation of economic cooperation, not just in the region, but again, across the Pacific, which I do believe as that partnership strengthens, as the economic relationship between the TPP countries as well as the APEC countries strengthens, I do think China will actually see the importance of, normalizing its economy in a way that, allows it to consider joining the TPP. I don't see this as a giveaway to China. I see this actually as the United States strengthening our rules of economic engagement and actually hearing the desire of the countries in the region to play by our economic rules, which are much fairer, which are much more equitable, and much more benevolent in helping those countries grow their economies, grow their stability. And I do see this as a key to building stability in the region. So, again, I applaud the administration's efforts, and I'll yield back.
Thanks, Mr. Barra. Mr. Lowenthal, did you have any questions?
Yeah, I have. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Statement by also applauding the not only the pivot to Asia, but the administration moving towards, in much more way, moving towards policies or strong stance on the South China Sea, and making sure that, being the adult in the room and talking about how we have freedom of navigation and that territorial disputes must be kind of resolved in a rational way. And I think that's really a very, very important message for the United States, not only to shift, but to send that message. I have three issues wanting to understand more about our role and maybe in either in ASEAN or APEC. One of them is human rights, another one is climate change, and the third one is Taiwan. And human rights, we've seen how human rights abuses in one nation can have a regional impact. The persecution of the Rohingya Muslims in Burma has created a refugee crisis that affects surrounding countries. Are these issues that are discussed in this kind of context? I'd really kind of like to know how those issues are being discussed. The same thing about climate change. How is the United States bringing up climate change in the context of these talks? Of developing nations in ASEAN that are expected to rapidly grow and develop in coming years, have they been receptive to these discussing emissions and how to limit them? And beyond emissions, how have the Asia-Pacific nations been preparing for adaptation and resiliency? And so that's the second. And the third one is, again, it's a lot of questions, is, you know, we've known that the presidents of mainland China, President Xi and President Ma, have held a historic meeting last month. And APEC is one of the few international bodies where the PRC and Taiwan both participate. Has APEC been historically a place where the two can cooperate? And has there been any? And do other APEC participants, have they facilitated any dialogue between Taiwan and the PRC? So take your stab at any of the three. Human rights, climate change, our role in Taiwan.
Thank you, Congressman. I think that those are, again, I think very important and relevant questions. I'll try to tackle the first two,
Okay.
if I can start. Human rights issues, without a doubt, are regularly discussed in a variety of different manners in these summits. For instance, trafficking in persons is an issue that is front and center in Southeast Asia and in this region, obviously. We do a lot of work programmatically and otherwise with the countries of ASEAN, bilaterally at 10, to try to address these issues and to strengthen regional cooperation. Just the other week, during the series of ASEAN summits, ASEAN itself actually inaugurated its own convention against trafficking in persons, especially women and children, which is a real step forward for ASEAN. And we are doing some work now with the member countries of ASEAN to try to ensure that they can begin to implement that convention. And so that is without a doubt a feature of these conversations. Other human rights issues obviously are regular features of our conversations, especially at the bilateral level, with all of these countries on the sidelines of them. And you saw President Obama make some comments about these issues when he was in Malaysia as well. And so again, this is a regular feature of our of all of our engagement in the region. With respect to climate change, this is obviously, again, a top priority for the administration. And with respect to ASEAN in particular, we in the last couple of years have been doing a lot of work with ASEAN. Last year in the 2014 summit, the leaders in the U.S.-ASEAN summit, the 11 leaders, agreed to a statement on climate change, which for the first time had all 11 countries and all 10 countries of ASEAN agreeing to put forth their intended nationally determined contributions well before Paris. At that point, I believe only one of the countries of ASEAN had done so, and to date, I think all but two now have done so. And the process of engaging with them on the negotiation of that statement, again, was a real boost and a chance for us to discuss a wide variety of
But I was
these
wondering, you know,
issues.
we're seeing a dramatic change in China. China, for a few years ago, said there's a critical difference between developing nations and developed nations in terms of setting standards. They have subsequently changed that position and really have come to now address that this is a critical issue for them also. Are we seeing with these developing nations, what is the discussion? Because they are further behind, and so I just would like to understand how do they see themselves as you know, on one hand they'll be tremendously impacted, especially those in Southeastern Asia that are on sea level rise. On the other hand, they have a long way to go, and so I'm just kind of wondering how that dynamic has been played out.
Well, I think if I can just to add, I think to answer your question, I think you summed it up actually quite well, the way in which they see this. This is both something that's going to affect them, so they need to adapt. They need to find ways to grow their economies in sustainable ways, and they are grappling with these issues right now in a very real and tangible way. They also recognize, though, that with respect to the global negotiations and the fact that this is a global issue and that there are many economies in Southeast Asia that are very large and are growing rapidly in terms of emissions. And so they also have a responsibility to contribute when it comes to reducing emissions. And so I think that they are trying to grapple with both of these issues at the same time. And for our part, again, we're trying to engage on both sides. The statement with respect to climate change last year was engaging them, I would say, a lot more on the latter side of it. How can we work together to reduce emissions? On the former side and the adaptation and growing sustainable economies, we've done a lot of work, including through one of our sub-ASEAN initiatives called the Lower Mekong Initiative, which works with the 5 countries of mainland Southeast Asia on a variety of transnational issues, frankly, the top one of which is climate change, the environment, and water, and the nexus between that and energy. And so we're doing a lot of work with those 5 countries to build local capacity.
Chair recognizes Mr. Shabbat.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I apologize for being a little late for this meeting. As some may have already mentioned, there's a Middle East committee hearing going on at the same time, so I'm trying to cover both areas. So just a couple of questions, and if you already asked these, somebody already asked they were answered. I apologize for that. But India has sought membership in APEC for 20 years and has been an observer since, I believe, 2011. However, some members of the U.S. business community have expressed doubts about India's role in APEC and feel that the U.S. should refrain from proactively supporting India's membership. Could you comment on that? And does the administration believe India has shown enough commitment to economic reform to warrant U.S. support in India's membership? Whoever wants to handle that.
Sure. Again, we do welcome India's interest in joining APEC. But we are, evaluating some of the considerations that you mentioned. I mean, it's important for economies that are interested in APEC to, demonstrate that their policies are aligned with the approaches in APEC for trade liberalization and economic reform. Also, APEC is a consensus-based organization, and so it's important for prospective members to indicate their ability to work in that environment, as well as to demonstrate their commitment to free trade and open trade investment. So, we are certainly, examining, these criteria as we look at this question.
Thank you. Next, President Xi continues to argue that China does not intend to pursue militarization in the South China Sea, but many experts would argue that it has already done so and that the artificial islands have both civilian and military applications. How were President Xi's arguments received by other Asian neighbors, many of whom are our allies? What steps is the U.S. taking to display an active leadership role in preventing China's militarization of the area, and what further steps might we contemplate from the administration?
Congressman, that's obviously a great question, and one on the front of a lot of our minds as well, coming out of these summits. First, to take a step back and get the second part of your question, I think that this administration has pursued a consistent strategy with respect to the South China Sea that is focused on upholding our interests in upholding international law and freedom of navigation, the peaceful resolution of disputes, and that's where our energy is focused. So we're doing that in a variety of ways. It's by making concerns directly known to the Chinese. It's by increasing our maritime security capacity building, just as the president announced some more funding for during his stop in Manila. It's by actively supporting the development of crisis mechanism tools, the availability of supporting the ability of countries to avail themselves of international legal mechanisms like arbitration, such as the Philippines is doing. And it's including, of course, by strengthening our defense posture in the region so we can ensure that we are upholding these variety of interests. But obviously, we're clear-eyed about the challenges that we face in the South China Sea. This is about, I think, shaping an environment to ensure that we can uphold these interests. So with respect to the President Xi's comments about militarization, I think that coming out of the East Asia Summit and the various summits, to your first question, the response was very clear. From the majority of the region is concerned about the actions taking place in the South China Sea. 10 of the leaders in the room at the East Asia Summit, including Premier Li, mentioned the importance of non-militarization of these outposts. And so we are looking to ensure that there is a regional consensus to ensure that there is no militarization and no further militarization of these outposts. That is our goal.
Thank you. Just one final comment. My time's ready to run out. But one of my real concerns that the administration has been sending in the whole defense area, and I'm sure this has some concern with our allies in the region, is that we're now down, or we will be if the president's proposals go forward, to have an army that we haven't seen is low in numbers since World War II. An Air Force that is getting older and is apparently at numbers under when we first had an Air Force. And on the naval front, whereas Ronald Reagan was trying to get it up to a 600-ship Navy, we're now down to 200 and some, which is levels that are all the way back to 1916 in the Navy area, and that's of particular concern in that part of the world. So I think some of the actions and some of what we talk about and what the president is proposing are inconsistent, and I'll leave it there since my time's run out. I yield back.
Up for another round of questions? I've got. What? Oh, you didn't have your first round. Okay, go ahead.
I'll try to make my questioning memorable enough.
We'll give you a second round, too.
Oh, good. For me, maybe not for the witnesses. We'll see. Mr. Fuchs, I'll ask you to just answer for the record just basic questions on the law of the sea, at least as interpreted by the United States. How big is the economic zone for an uninhabited reef or island that is submerged at high tide? What is the size of the economic zone for an uninhabited island or reef that at least a little bit is above the water at high tide? And what is the economic zone for an inhabited island? And what is the economic zone for an island that's been uninhabited for the last few millennia, but the Chinese government puts one fisherman's family on it and gives him a free boat and tells him that he's got to live there, whether he likes it or not, but he does get a free boat, and then after maybe 5 or 10 years they put a different, in other words, habitation that begins only after the South China Sea becomes a huge area of dispute, but islands that have been uninhabited for at least the last millennia as far as we know. Now, for questions for an oral response. We got a $600 billion military budget, especially if you throw in veterans benefits, which are a cost of compensating our troops. And it's hard for any cost accountant to tell you what portion of that $600 billion is properly allocable to the cost of defending world security in the Eastern Pacific or the Asia-Pacific area. But when I talk to the military about, say, research projects, they say, we're not interested in doing research on anything that's going to help us in the Middle East. We want all of our research to be how to shoot down Chinese planes over the South China Sea. And so, knowing that no one could possibly refute it because we can't possibly know, I'll say that we're now spending, say, a third of our military budget focused on the Asia-Pacific area, and we're on our way to spending half, or $300 billion. So whether it's $200 billion, whether it's $300 billion, whether it's $200 billion now, whether it's $300 billion later, how much collectively is Japan, the Philippines, and South Korea spending on their total military, all of which is devoted to the East Asia area? And any chance they're increasing their budgets or collective budgets by $100 billion or anything close to that?
Before you answer those questions, I just want to say, if you can get them all off the top of your head, I'm going to buy you a milkshake.
I'm going to buy him a drink. And if you prefer, you can just you can just respond for the record and answer the more general. Give me solid numbers for the general. But is there any evidence of tens of billions of dollars of increase in the defense budgets of Japan, South Korea, and Philippines?
Congressman, I will have to look into some of these questions to get back to you with some specific answers for the record, so that I can make sure that they are accurate. What I can tell you about your first question, although I am not a lawyer, is that my understanding is that with respect to some of the general explanations of features, is that if there is a feature that is submerged, it derives nothing.
Right.
No territorial sea, no.
We agree on that. Yeah.
So,
I just
right.
threw that in to give you more questions to answer for the record.
Right. So we can provide you with some of the other answers. To those.
But what'll be interesting is the inhabited and then the never inhabited before, but now that there's a dispute, there's a fisherman. Okay. Mr. Hirsch. Okay, we've got the rules of origin under TPP. But if you control the entire supply chain, if you own the factory in China and you own the factory in Vietnam, or you just have a cooperative relationship, but you could own it. A factory that's Chinese owned but operate and the goods are 70% made in China, 30% made in Vietnam. If the rule of origin is 30%, they get duty free in the United States, right?
The rule of origin varies by product.
Right.
So,
Yeah, for many products. I know for others it'll be 40%, others will be 45%.
There has to be a verification, or there can be verification in examining the eligibility of a product. So
How would you possibly do that with less than 50,000 accountants?
well, the way that we've, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Congressman, the way that we have approached that in our past FTAs, that we would approach that here as well, is just through a multi-layered approach where there are spot checks, verifications.
Okay.
Well, if there's a
Every
suspicion-
invoice, every intercompany billing decision is totally in the control of those who want the free entry of the product. What spot checking? I mean, your spot checking could verify that nothing was being done to the product in Vietnam, but how would you possibly know whether it was 33% or 23% Vietnamese made?
Well, spot checks are one of the mechanisms which are used to confirm a rule of origin. Customs also conducts verifications in which they actually go on site and examine the company's books in great detail.
But the books are made by the company. I mean, have you ever done you've never been involved on the tax side, but we do this in the Section 482 audits. There's no chance of catching. Every invoice, every decision, every booking, you get to look at the company's books. They'll put on the books what you need to put on the books. How are we supposed to say that if the left side of the product was made in China and the right side of the product was made in Vietnam, that it's incorrect to say that the Chinese portion is only 42%?
Well, they have to follow generally accepted accounting principles, and customs.
I'm probably the only CPA in the room, and I know generally accepted accounting principles do not answer the question. What it means is goods that are maybe 10 or 15% in reality made in Vietnam get duty-free into the United States. So China knows that even if we decide to push them with higher tariffs on their own goods, they can just stamp the Made in Vietnam sticker on it, bring it into the United States. I yield back.
We're going to do another round. If you want to answer that
Go
question,
ahead.
then we'll
Yeah.
go to the next one, because I'll get you another chance so you can get.
Okay, then I'll.
How about we move on to Mr. Connolly, and then
Yes.
you think about the answer to that one, because we're going to go
we'll
back
give you a
around
chance.
again.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I gotta say, the implication here is that Vietnam and China are in collusion because Vietnam is just so much in love with China and everything Chinese. I think that's a false premise.
If the gentleman will yield.
I would yield.
My question was a company in Vietnam entirely owned by China would cooperate with its parent company. And of course, it would be in the interests of the Vietnamese government to let this happen, because at least they're
but I'm
getting
not-
some of the jobs.
Okay, but you seem to be making sweeping conclusions from that, as if everyone's going to cheat, and that clearly, apparently, Chinese companies are going to dominate trade in 12 countries involving 40% of the world's economy. I think that's a false premise, and I think it's a misleading suggestion. The fact that some people may cheat is sort of the human condition. My question, Mr. Hirsch, would be, you got ridiculed for talking about spot checks, so please don't talk about spot checks. Surely we have some other mechanisms, however, for verifying the nature of goods and services coming into the United States or crossing borders pursuant to this pending trade agreement.
Well, we do. As with other mechanisms, we have, with other FTAs, we have on-site verifications in which the books are examined in great detail. And if anything incorrect is found, there's the potential for enforcement actions where there would be penalties involved for providing inaccurate.
So, for example, of the example used, a Chinese-owned company operating in, say, Cholon in former Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City, if we were able to catch them cheating, there would be consequences?
Yes, there would.
What would those consequences be?
Well, in addition to the obvious consequence of denying them the benefits of the agreement, there are penalties under our customs statutes for providing incorrect information.
So when a company decides to cheat, pursuant to the example given my friend from California, they have to calculate the risk here. And it's not a consequence-free risk if caught. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Would there be consequences for the host country, for Vietnam? Since the private company, the example given by my friend Mr. Sherman, is not a signatory to the agreement, the government of Vietnam is. Are there consequences to the government of Vietnam for either turning a blind eye, acquiescing, or simply being malfeasant with respect to this cheating?
Well, at the very least, they would have an interest in not seeing their exporters cheating, because it's going to expose their other exporters to closer scrutiny.
No, but my question was, does the pending agreement penalize the host country if it knowingly or even blindly allows such blatant cheating as described by my friend from California?
I would probably have to take a closer look at that question. It really would, but if it's merely a question of one of their companies doing this, I don't know that the country itself would be penalized.
Okay, if it were a pattern, however, if there were thousands of Chinese-owned companies engaging in this kind of subterfuge, would there be consequences for the government of Vietnam?
I'll have to take a closer look at that question and get back to you. But if in fact they were, involved in encouraging that behavior, then
Well,
certainly
it's a
there-
pretty significant question my friend from California is asking, and I think it's pretty important that you
Understood.
answer it hopefully forthrightly and forcefully, because frankly, this goes to the question of, are there teeth in the enforcement of this agreement or not? Are there consequences for serious patterns of evasion and cheating or not? If there aren't, then the treaty isn't worth much.
I understand.
We
your
already
question.
have cheating without a treaty. My friend also asked Mr. Fuchs questions about defense spending. Our NATO allies, are they all meeting their goals in defense spending? They're all spending billions of dollars more in defense spending right now too, right?
Congressman, I work in the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs, so
How compartmentalized?
I,
Well, are you aware of the fact that there's a 2% goal for NATO members, that we want you to be spending 2% of your GDP on defense? Are you aware of any, besides the United States, member of NATO who in fact is meeting that goal?
I would have to get back to you on that,
Hmm.
Congressman.
Well, would it surprise you to learn not one? Would it surprise you to learn that most of them, in fact, are retreating from the goal rather than advancing toward the goal? I only point that out because it's not unique to Asia that our allies, in fact, are not meeting defense investment goals. My friend mentioned the Middle East too, but I'd be interested in seeing data on the Middle East when you can talk to your colleagues You know, how's Jordan doing? How's Israel doing? How's Egypt doing? And what percentage of their current defense spending is coming from the United States? Japan's defense budget, we provide a protective umbrella. We have a collaborative relationship, but we don't subsidize their defense that I'm aware of. But when you get back to us for the record, I'd be interested in seeing that data. But I think it's important that the State Department give us the comparative data, because I don't want the suggestion being that Asia's unique. It isn't. So I would request you add to that, knowing and stipulating that you're in your compartment, but the State Department covers the world, and if you can get back to us, I'd appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Hirsch, I have a question for you. And before I ask the question, I want to precurse it by saying that this is my 10th year in Congress. It was kind of bifurcated. I started in 94 and I served to 2000. Bill Clinton was the president. And now I'm going on my, well, next year will be my 4th year back, my 2nd time round. During that whole time, I've supported every free trade agreement that has come before us in the Congress. I voted for TPA, and so I'm very robust. I've held many hearings trying to be very supportive of the TPP process, because I know how important it is both to our country and to the region. That having been said, what are you guys at USTR or the administration doing to manage the expectations of the other 10 TPP countries that it is probably pretty likely that we're not going to get something out of the Congress approving that next year? I mean, we're entering the silly season, and the leading candidate on the president's side has come out against it, even though she helped shepherd it through when she was Secretary of State. Many of our candidates on the Republican side are coming out against it as well. It's a bizarre world, but the fact is, TPA passed this body by 4 votes, and given some of the challenges now, and the vote will be sometime at best in the spring, I think it's very likely that TPP is not going to be ratified by the Congress next year. And I say that not because I hope that or because I want that. I think it's just a fact of life that we're all going to have to deal with. I've had lots of conversations with the ambassadors from these TPP countries, and they've expressed to me their interest in being patient and staying the course and waiting for a good deal. I know that you're real concerned, as I am, about a vacuum being filled by China, and all those arguments are very good and forthcoming, but the fact remains that politically it's going to be a real heavy lift, if not impossible, to get it through next year. What are you doing to manage the expectations of those TPP partners so that they'll stay patient and stay in the boat?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Right now we are focused on making the case for TPP here in Congress and before the American people, and we're confident that when we've made that case, that there will be the support. With regard to our trading partners. And you have supporters up here. Thank you. We I think our colleagues in TPP are following our processes closely, and I think they're aware of the challenges we face, and but share our optimism as well. Thanks.
It's always great to be really optimistic, and I know every football team goes in with the idea that they're going to come out victorious, but at the end of the game, somebody comes out wins and somebody comes out losing, and I think there has to be a plan B. This is too important to not have a plan B, and I hope that the administration is managing the expectations because I don't want them to, our partners, to lose heart and think that, that if it doesn't pass next year, that it's off the table, because I don't believe that's the case.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Connolly.
I just want to echo what you said. I couldn't agree with you more. I think timing is everything, actually. And Mr. Hirsch, I wish we lived in a world of pure reason and rational actors, but I don't think the dynamic for approval of this agreement is simply a matter of more information. The more people know, the more they'll come to love it. I wish that were true, but I don't think it is. That doesn't. You've got to do your job, and we understand that. But I think timing is everything, and I think the chairman has said it well. And if the timing is wrong, it's not like we have some huge cushion to fall back on in terms of support up here. I believe TPA passed by a margin of 10. Was it 10? I thought it was 218 to 208, but anyway, whatever. It was not a lot to spare, to the chairman's point. And that's why, frankly, getting the timing right is really critical. So I echo what he said as a supporter of the agreement and of TPA, but this is going to be a slog and a bit of trench warfare.
And it would be prudent to have a plan B. Chair recognizes Mr. Sherman.
I would very much hope that trade decisions were made on the basis of pure reason and rational actors, in which case we would have a completely different trade policy than we've had for the last 30 years when we've decimated the American middle class. I do want to agree with the gentleman from Virginia that as much Chinese cheating as may go on under this agreement, that will not be the lion's share of all the trade that occurs under this agreement. Toyota will be a Japanese company, whether we ratify is the wrong word, whether Congress approves the agreement or not. But just to show you how incredibly difficult it is to stop cheating, I want to put in the record 2 articles. One is U.S. put China-made parts in the F-35 fighter program. There is no way that we are auditing Vietnamese and Chinese textile firms as carefully as our national security is focusing on the parts in the F-35. Even there, cheating happens. Counterfeit Chinese parts slipping into U.S. military aircraft, ABC News, is the second article that I would put in the record if there's no objection.
Could I just say to my friend, we're willing to audit every one of those firms if we get your vote.
Don't promise what you can't deliver. The idea that that you can catch this and will penalize it when you catch it. Yes, you can audit the books, but I'm the only one in the room who's ever written one of these books. And you put in the books what you want to put in the books. You could easily value at 0 for intercompany transactions the value of Chinese intellectual property in the product, and value at a high value intellectual property that happened to be owned by one of the subsidiaries in Vietnam or Malaysia. There are so many ways to handle this, not to mention the profit margins. You could set a profit margin at 0 of what the Chinese company ships to its Vietnamese subsidiary. And those are the above-board legitimate ways to cheat. That doesn't even involve lying, just setting the prices differently. But the other concern I have is on co-production agreements. Now and then China does import something from the United States. And what they do is they say, okay, you think you're getting jobs because we're buying these planes. But in order to buy your planes, you have to build a factory in China to build the fuselages, not just for the planes that we're selling to China, but the planes you're selling all over the world. Now that's great if all you're concerned with is Wall Street profits, because you move the fuselage factory to China, maybe you'll make even more money. But you, of course, lose the jobs. And once this deal goes forward, and China has another route to ship its goods into the United States, we will never be able to demand that we don't have co-production agreements. But Mr. Hirsch, is there anything in this agreement that says that a Vietnamese airline or a Malaysian airline can't prefer one aircraft supplier over the other based on which one is willing to produce parts for its plane or to have manufacturing facilities in the buying country. Our co-production agreement's banned.
Thank you, Congressman. That is a very specific question that I don't have the answer right here.
Furnish it for the record,
And
please.
we'll look into that. Thanks.
And I think I had asked another question prior to others that you might want to respond to. And do you have any other comments on any of the other parts of my diatribe that have been focused on you?
Sir, only to say that, you know, we have a number of FTAs, and that the enforcement of rules of origin is something which is an issue in every single FTA. You know, we do have a track record there, and Customs, you know, does look at these issues very seriously.
Okay. We here in Washington are cut off. Even I should probably be required to go and sit in the back of a Trump rally. If you think that our prior FTA's enforcement is what America wants, that we've been doing a great job, that there's no cheating under our existing rules, that everything's hunky-dory and the middle class is doing well in the United States, then you and I should sit in the back of a Trump rally together and see the anger. I won't say that the focus of the solution for that anger, electing Mr. Trump as president, is the solution, but the anger is there, and the anger is because for 30 years America hasn't gotten a raise, especially those who do not have grad school degrees. So I've gone way over time. I thank the chairman for his indulgence, and I yield back.
You've given Steve and I an opportunity to think about a present that we could give you, maybe one of those Trump Make America Great hats.
The greatest present that you could give to my party, and the worst thing, or one of the worst things you could do for my country, is to nominate the presidential candidate who's got the hat.
All right, and on that note, Mr. Shabbat.
Thank you very much. Rather than discuss, never mind, I'm just going to stay away from that altogether. I'm going to something less controversial, and it's TPA and TPP. As one who also supported TPA and is inclined to support TPP, or certainly was inclined, and TTIP and other trade agreements, I've generally been considered a free trader over my career. I was at a meeting this morning where a fairly prominent person indicated that in Chapter 20 of TPP is language that, in essence, requires that TPP implementation of any environmental agreements that are agreed to in other forums, a forum similar to the one that President Obama recently participated in Paris. And a lot of ears perked up, including mine at that point, and I went and read the language myself, and it seemed relatively vague. I see that you could interpret it that way. I think you could perhaps interpret it a different way. But it can, Mr. Hirsch, on behalf of the administration, can you give us some clarification on that issue?
I will have to defer to my colleagues back at USTR who are more familiar with the details of that particular issue, if that's okay.
Okay, yeah, I'd like to get that as quickly as we can and as much detail as we can and clarification, because if that is the case, you know, that would give a lot of people some real heartburn. So I'll yield back at this point.
A great and a lively discussion. I really congratulate the two of you for sitting through this and being so patient and diligent in your answers and your testimony. We really appreciate it. So thank you very much, and this committee is now adjourned.